Welcome to another edition of Bad Catholic Book Notes. This is my back to school book report entitled What I Read This Summer. First, as part of my debriefing from the trip to Israel that my wife and I took the last 2 weeks in May, I read The Lonely Soldier by Adam Harmon. And this book is about Harmon, who's an American, and who first went to Israel on a birthright tour that a lot of young Jewish kids take to Israel, where they're sponsored, and a trip to Israel is paid for for them to get in touch with their heritage as Jewish youth. And of course, Harmon fell in love with the country, fell in love with his Jewish heritage. And even though, as he says in here, his family wasn't particularly religious, and he decides to, he goes back to Israel. He works for a summer in a kibbutz, and finally, ultimately, he decides to become an Israeli citizen and to join the Israeli army. And in the early 1990s, and this is a story about his experiences in the Israeli army. It's really interesting. The lonely soldier means that that's a term that the Israeli army uses for somebody that doesn't have any family in Israel, who's serving in the IDF, in the Israeli Defense Force. And Harmon talks about that he spoke Hebrew, but not very well, and he should have been given a remedial Hebrew course before he went to his training, but he didn't get to do that. He had to take the training first, and then he got to go to the Hebrew remedial Hebrew course. Harmon wanted to be in an elite unit, so he tried out for it and was accepted by an elite unit of paratroopers. It's just a very interesting read. It is about his experiences in the Israeli army, and the Israeli incursion into Lebanon in the early 90s, and of course the war with the war with Iraq was going on with the United States during that period of time, and the Saddam Hussein was launching Scud missiles at Israel and all of that, and he has a really good experience in the Israeli army. He does experience some combat. He comments here on the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and dealing with the Palestinians. It's just really interesting. If you want to know about an American's take on the Israeli situation and the Palestinian situation from the inside, Lonely Soldier by Adam Harmon. It's interesting that he finally, after he leaves the Israeli army, he really can't find a good job to support himself in Israel, so he winds up ultimately returning back to the United States, which Harmon says is a not uncommon occurrence, because Israel's such a small country and things, and it's hard for they've got a lot of overqualified people for the number of jobs and things that they have, so it's hard to for everybody to be fully employed like they ought to be. Lonely Soldier by Adam Harmon. Highly recommend that. Next is part of my debriefing from the Israel trip. I read this, and this is called American Evangelicals and Modern Israel: A Plea for Tough Love, by Frederick M. Martin, and just got furbombed here by a huge just got firebombed by a huge 20-pound cat. So that was the cause of the technical difficulty, was the firebombing by the 20-pound terrorist cat. But this is American Evangelicals in Modern Israel, A Plea for Tough Love by Frederick M. Martin. And Martin is a evangelical minister. And he pastor is from northern Minnesota, and he's been a pastor for about 40 years. This was published in 2016. And Martin is very critical of Christian Zionism. And Christian Zionism is just what it says. It's Christians who are unconditional supporters of who support the Jewish state and the state of Israel for religious reasons, and are unconditional supporters of it, and who believe that all the promises that God made to the children of Israel in the Old Testament, that all of those all apply to the modern state of Israel. And Martin's very critical of that. He talks about that a lot of that comes out of the theology of premillennial dispensationalism, and he's very critical of that. Martin argues here that that the promises made to to Israel in the Old Testament don't apply to the modern state of Israel, because the successor of the modern state of Israel is the Christian church. The successor to biblical Israel, according to Martin, is the Christian church. That the coming of Christ, who Christians believe is the Jewish Messiah, that fulfills all of the prophecies of the Old Testament are all fulfilled in the coming of Christ, and that all the promises made to Israel in the Old Testament don't apply to the modern state of Israel. In other words, he's very critical of a lot of these evangelicals and fundamentalists who will argue that when Scripture says that whoever curses Israel is cursed, and whoever blesses Israel is blessed, and that the Israelites are given the land by God, that he's very critical of the position that all of that all applies to the modern state of the modern state of Israel. And he's also very critical of the occupation of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Israeli treatment of Palestinians. He's very critical of that, and he thinks that evangelicals should re-examine their Christian Zionist position. If you're interested in this topic, I recommend this, American Evangelicals and Modern Israel, A Plea for Tough Love by Frederick M. Martin. All right, well, moving onward, excuse the cat's tail. As part of my devotional reading and Lectio Divina for the last several months, I slowly read a page or two at a time and digested Bread in the Wilderness, which is Thomas Merton's extended essay on the book of Psalms. This is a really beautiful book. There's a lot of beautiful writing in here. And this is a paperback facsimile of the first edition, published in 1953. And that's a medieval crucifix that's in a church in France, and there are pictures and close-ups of that medieval crucifix throughout this book, and so the book itself is beautiful, but the writing's really beautiful in here, and a lot of food for thought in here. Okay, we're experiencing another technical difficulty. No! Experiencing another technical difficulty. We have been fur bombed here in the studio by a giant 20-pound cat. But Merton talks about in here how we can profit, how our prayer profits by the Psalms, and even the cursing Psalms, and really, 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 really beautiful book for devotional reading. I do have to say that I like the pre-Vatican II Merton a lot better than I like the 1960s, for lack of a better term, the Zen Merton. Um, um, I kind of liked him when he was a stuffy old pre-Vatican II fundamentalist Catholic. I tend to like his writing better than after he got hip and wanted to go meditate with Zen Buddhists and all that kind of stuff, which is not necessarily I'm not necessarily all that critical of that, but anyway, I appreciated this a whole lot. All right, and also on the Thomas Merton, I read this, Beneath the Mask of Holiness by Mark Shaw, Thomas Merton, and the Forbidden Love Affair that set him free. And this book kind of has a reputation of being a hatchet job. I don't really think it was terribly unfair to Merton. And of course, folks that know about Thomas Merton, Merton fans know that what happened was in the mid '60s that Merton went for an operation in a hospital in Louisville, Kentucky, from the monastery of Our Lady of Gethsemane, which is outside Louisville, where he was at as a Trappist monk. And there was a student nurse named Margie Smith, and she gave Merton a nice sponge bath, and one thing led to the other, and Merton was a nice red-blooded American male. He definitely was not one of these priests that were messing with little boys, because Merton definitely was a heterosexual and liked girls. One thing led to the other, and their relationship got really out of hand. And Merton was having people come and check him, his friends come and check him out of the monastery, and taking him to go meet this girl. And he had gotten really out of hand. And of course, then Merton was confronted by the abbot and decided to end the relationship with Margie and return to his vows, even though he toyed with the idea of leaving the monastery and the priesthood to go marry this girl, which the Trappist order was doing apparently everything they could to keep that from happening, because that would have been a public relations disaster for the most famous Catholic monk and most famous Catholic priest in the world to leave to go marry a girl half his age. There's some really good stuff in here, which are in a lot of other books about Merton, like that there was the psychologist that told him that he was like a guy sitting in the middle of Times Square with a gigantic neon sign with an arrow pointing to him that says hermit. So Merton kept wanting to be a hermit and have all this solitude, and moved out to the hermitage separate from the monastery. But then he's got like Joan Baez coming to see him, and Martin Luther King, and people are bringing him bottles of whiskey, and he's not acting very monk-like. As for me, it's actually comforting to me that this spiritual giant had feet of clay, and and struggled with sexuality, and struggled with sin and all these issues. That's actually comforting for me, to know that, on one respect, this man that was so close to God, um, and and was a master of contemplative spirituality, and did so much in his writing to convey a sense of the presence of God to other people. It's actually comforting to find out that he was human, and and he was a sinner just like all the rest of us. Um, so, Beneath the Mask of Holiness by Mark Shaw, Thomas Merton, and the Forbidden Love Affair that set him free. And this was published way back in 2009. All right, talking about other priests with problems. This is called The Dictator Pope, The Inside Story of the Francis Papacy by Mark Antonio Colonna. Mark Antonio Colonna is a pseudonym, a pen name. This book is actually the author is Henry Sire, and Henry Sire is a British a British historian, and Henry Sire don't like Pope Francis. He thinks that Pope Francis is a dangerous, radical liberal. He thinks that he's running the church the same way that Juan Perón ran Argentina, that he tells everybody what he wants to hear, that he is a ruthless authoritarian, and that he was installed by the St. Gallen Mafia as Pope, who took over the conclave, and were lobbying to get their man elected to make all these liberal changes in the church. And Henry Sire was, even though the Knights was big in the Knights of Malta, and of course the Knights of Malta are supposed to be totally separate from the church. The Pope's not supposed to have any jurisdiction over them, and reportedly Pope Francis pulled a bunch of strings and things, and Henry Sire got basically thrown out of the Knights of Malta on account of this book. So really interesting. The Dictator Pope, The Inside Story of the Francis Papacy, Mark Antonio Colonna. All right, then, last but not least, we got this, To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism by Ross Douthat. And this is along the same lines as Dictator Pope, but Douthat doesn't hate Pope Francis like Henry Sire does. He is concerned about the theological direction that Francis is taking the church. He's very concerned that Amoris Laetitia is causing a theological rift, that if the church changes its position on communion for the divorced and remarried, that basically that's going to be like a nuclear bomb that's going to undermine all of the church's other theology, and that it also will undermine sexual ethics and morality. Douthat's very concerned that there's going to be a schism. Of course, this was written before the Pope changed the catechism about the death penalty, which there are a lot of conservative theologians and commentators that are saying, well, okay, he's changed the catechism and said that the death penalty is not allowable under any circumstances now. So does that mean that the old catechism was wrong? And So anyway, very good, very interesting. To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism by Ross Douthat, who's who's an op-ed columnist for the New York Times on religion, and very, very, very good book. And actually, if I had to pick between the two, I would tell you to read this one. This is fun. If 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 you like people, if you like ranting and raving and really getting after somebody, this is the one. But this is much more measured. So if I had to recommend one of these two books about the Francis papacy and what it's doing to the church, I'd say that one. Okay, well, so that's what I've been reading this summer. That's what I read that's what I read over the summer, and so that's it. So God bless, and I'll see y'all later. And this is Tommy. This is Tommy, Terrorist Cat, and so Tommy and Bad Catholic say, see y'all later. Bye.